So in this video we're going to do an example of how you would include a picker view in some type of an app for an online store or something where the user would be presented with merchandise they could select. First we're going to create some blank space to put our picker view, and we're going to have a button to place the order and a label to display the status of the order. First thing we're going to do is open up the main.storyboard, get to the object library and drop our picker view there. We have a date picker as well as a picker view where you can put your own customized items. So with a picker view we can customize what data goes there. Let's move things around to make it look with a good flow. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Now let's take a look at the different options available through the attributes view. There are very few options available with a custom data picker. Most of the stuff you do is going to be with Swift code, unlike a date picker, which does give you quite a few pre-available attributes to select. So let's look at the date picker here and go to the attributes view. So you can take a look at all your options that are available there, and I do hope you're following along with me. Maybe you can somehow watch this video on your phone while you're typing in on your laptop. In the custom data picker, you have virtually no options, right? It's all Swift code. So let's add the picker view to our app. Now go to our view controller Swift file. And there's your recipe, which is also available in the PowerPoints I provided. So take a couple of seconds to read through that and become familiarized with it. We did talk about all this stuff last week in the lecture. It's all in your instructional materials from that as well. So first thing we're going to need to do is create an outlet for our picker and code. And then we're going to provide some of the protocols that are needed by the picker view. Protocol, as you recall, is like an interface from C#. It is a behavioral specification. It specifies which methods must be included but does not provide the implementation. It's a template or a contract. And there are two protocols we need to implement for a picker view. And you recall from last week's lecture the mandatory picker view functions we need to implement. There's a lot of functions that come with picker views. There's a bunch of methods inside the class that allow the picker view to function correctly. You're going to have to take a couple of those methods and implement them in your code. Specifically, the three functions that you need to implement: number of components, number of rows, and title for row. After you've implemented those functions, you have to provide your data source for what needs to be displayed. In our case, it'll be an array. In practice, it may be a database call or an API call. Then we're going to connect our data to the picker view functions in the picker view's APIs. So let's open up our assistant editor. So first we're going to have to make some outlets. I'm not going to talk through it, you know what to do. Always pay attention that you're implementing the right type, UI Picker View in this case. Type along with me at home, please. Alright, now let's close the storyboard and get back into viewcontroller.swift. And you can close the side panels to focus only on what you need to be looking at right now, especially if you have a smaller screen. The Picker View protocols. So after the superclass we're subclassing from, hit the comma. First is UI Picker View. Delegate. And you can count on autocomplete to help you out here as well. Learning to use the pop-up and auto-completion is critical because you're not going to remember all these details. Now we have our UI Picker View data source. So here we have UI Picker View data source. Pay attention to the red line. Let's click on it and see what happens. The tool is offering to help us out by adding the protocol stubs, so click on Fix. If you don't implement them, the code's not going to work. Here we have number of components. We remember from last week, components and columns both start with CO. That gives us the number of columns in the view. So number of components, one of the three mandatory functions. Now let's take care of our data source protocol requirements. So that's how many rows will be available in the Picker View. Right, so this function defines how many columns you want in your Picker View. And this function defines the total number of rows that will be returned from your data source. So you're seeing it's returning an int. So if I said return 5 and I'm showing an array of countries, it'll return 5 countries. Number of components returns the number of columns you have in your Picker View. For example, on the screen, see a multi-column date picker, so we have months and days. So what are you going to be returning here? Pay attention to the return type through the arrow notation, integerial value. So you're returning an integer here. So for a multi-column picker view, that's going to be more than one, right? Let's get back to our recipe. We finished step C. The third mandatory function is also called picker view. And it tells us what data should be displayed. You see there it's returning a string. So here we see overloaded formats of the picker view function, right? Same name, but different parametric input signature. And we could copy and paste the code, but we prefer to use the autocomplete feature to train our eye as to what code and what parameters are going to be provided. So search for the one you want. So keep typing till you narrow it down to the one that's right. So click on it, or you can press the tab key, and now you have to fill in the code stub. This function specifies what data should actually be displayed in the picker view. We're just going to sub in some sample code till we get our array in there. For right now, every item's just going to be called ABC. Let's try running the app and see what happens. Why is the picker view empty right now? Just two faint lines. Did we forget to present something, I wonder? We didn't finish setting up our picker view delegate yet. There's one extra step we have to do. Let's go down to our view.load function. Self.pickerview.delegate equals self. And we know what self is. We've talked about it several times. It's the context of the object we're in. There will be another thing we'll be adding in here to connect to the actual data source. Let's run it and see how it makes out. So it's loaded, and we have our view there, and we have our default sub data in, or just our stub data. So compare what we see on the screen with what we see in our controller file. How many items do we have? 5. And every one is just our sub value of ABC. In order to make something appear, it's not just good enough to put the functions. We do need to specify this line here on line 58 in viewDidLoad. Self.PickReview is the name of the outlet we specified for this pick review. Another thing to consider about the pick review title: if you want to be able to distinguish between each row, you have to access the row parameter. And let's see an example of how we can specify the line number of each element. There we're dereferencing using backslash, brackets notation, and grabbing the value of row. Let's hit save and run it again, and there we see each item is also showing its numeric value in the array. The number represents the current row of that item. It looks like array indexing in this case. And the last item is indexed as length -1. That's how arrays work. So type along with me, please. Pay attention to the code, drink it in. Now, how do we update what's shown in the picker? So how are we going to hook this up to a data source? The data source could be an array, a text file, or a connection to a data source through an API or a database. Maybe do a SQL pull. Let's try grocery list items, so we'll say let, and our variable is grocery items, and we'll feed it an array, the form Swift recognizes. How do we tell the pick review we want to display this array of elements? How do we hook up this data source? So a standard practice might be to do a SQL pull and store the SQL results in an array. But it is a common practice when you're developing to just use a simple array to get everything working. Let's go back down to the viewDidLoad function. So now we're going to start with self as always, .PickReview, which is a reference to your IBO, now .DataSource equals self. And those are just, that's the code formulation you need to use to make this work properly. So remember, add the protocols to the definition of the class, and then go right away to viewDidLoad and add those two lines in so you don't forget them. You don't want to forget about it later. you're going to get weird errors and you won't realize why you're getting them. Now let's come down into these mandatory functions. In terms of the number of columns, that's not going to change. So we don't have to change this. We do have to change the two functions that are called pick review. So let's say we're returning 3 items, bread, milk, and paper. Now let's change the function that has the title for row parameter. That's what displays the data onto the screen. The fast way to do it is to grab the data source and pass in the row parameter as the array index. It just works this way when you do it in Swift. You're not explicitly doing a for each loop as you might in C#, but Swift knows how to interpret this. It's giving you some time to type along and follow on. Let's run the app. Now we see that result happening. We're seeing our array data appearing in our picker view when it's available to be selected. That pretty much concludes how you're going to hook up your data source. Don't forget your 3 mandatory functions. Returning the number of columns. Returning the number of data items you want to display. So let's update title for row, which is going to be the name of your data source. And that'll hook up the visual aspect of your data source. What about number of rows in component? Now we're returning a static number. You probably figured out it would make more sense to grab the array and access the length value of it. So if we change the number of data elements, we don't have to remember to change that number. And there you go, array.count. So let's finish up the app by hooking up the place order button. When we click on place order, we should update the order status label with the stuff we've picked. So let's go ahead and set up some IBO outlets for our button and our label. open up Assistant Editor, and you know what to do with click and drag. So let's call it results label. Now, inside the order button pressed, get what was selected from the picker view. Display it in the label. Type along, pause the video if you need to. How do we get what was selected in the picker view? Let's go to self.pickerViewOutlet. It has a property called selected row. So now we need to get the column of our picker. So you're going to have more than one column. Type along, pause the video if you need to. Here we just have one column, so we'll set that at 0. So we'll create a constant selected index. And let's just do a debugging trace message so we can track our work in the debugging console. So here it's going to be grocery items array and square brackets selected index. Let's do string interpolation, combine it into one line. So let's do a spin and see if that information is in fact materializing in our output label. So select something. Yeah, so it's getting acquired in the code. That's good. So we're able to select items. So far, so good. So that tells you that you can use the pickerView.selectedRow property to find out what the user selected. Let's see about getting into the results label now. Let's see if it works. Hopefully it will. This concludes how to use picker views. Obviously, if you wanted to acquire several items from the user, you're free to go and add each one to an array. Maybe pass it over to a payment processor if you wanted to run a real e-store. Remember your picker view delegate and your picker view data source. You then go down to your view did load section. Well, first of all, you have to create your outlets, and then you access your outlets through the self variable, and you follow this code formulation. Follow the recipe, gentlemen and ladies. Follow the recipe. Put in your mandatory functions, number of columns. One of them specifies the picker view. The other one controls the text which is displayed. And your data source in your development stage of things is generally just a simple array. You would build out your database pull later on. Isolation test it, it's good. Don't do too much at one time. So get the visual aspect of it going properly, and then implement your coding logic. The item that they picked would get output to the screen in this case. In practice, you would probably package it up in another class to be processed down the road. So selected row takes the parameter, and you have to specify the column you want to get that value from. Type in the code and run it. It's the only way to learn.